In your view, does the regulator have a role to not just look at the licensing of aircrew and the technical airworthiness of the aircraft, but also the fitness for purpose of, in the terms of an AOC licence? Is that fitness for purpose part of the remit that either is there or should be there?
It probably should be there. I think what CAS is in a no-win situation is that do you have prescriptive legislation which makes it easier for the regulator to check people's compliance, or do you have outcome-based legislation which is then problematic for CASA because they have to assess so many different procedures from so many different operators to see if it has the same outcome. And that's a problem for CASA. I don't think CASA can ever win with it, but what you're saying is an excellent point, because in this case, the delegated responsibility of the regulations for that fitness of purpose lies with the chief pilot, and it's very clearly marked out in my report. He's responsible, or she is responsible, for the aircraft to be on that type of operation. And I think CASA would probably argue, and they would be right, in saying that that is the chief pilot's responsibility, ultimately.
My understanding is that for firms that are engaged in charter work and aerial work, that often they will have standard routes where they exist and pre-planned information. Clearly in an EMS case, there are lots of unknowns, lots of variability. Is it reasonable in your mind for an operator to have essentially at least planned the potential combinations that may work or may not work, and to submit that to the regulator as an example of where using their own procedures, so again, outcomes based, but demonstrating within their system why this range of operations is fit for purpose with the machinery they're looking to use?
Yes, I think that is a good idea that CASA could do on their audits in these types of on-the-run operations that are reactive to requests, such as EMS work. Having done it myself in helicopters, all I can say back when I was doing it, we didn't have computers, but we had a very simple system of where we could work out the range of how far we could go on a particular job on a simple basis. It wasn't sort of done that on the run. We had a very simple board where we would measure the distance, work out our fuel capabilities, weather, etc. But in this case, I think if an operator had limited airports to go to, such as the Pacific, it would be an expectation of mine, if I was the chief pilot, that I would work out, well, if I'm going to fly from Samoa to Norfolk Island, then on to Australia, I'm probably going to not be able to do it in headwinds more than, 50 knots, for example. You could easily work that out. So you would think that there would be situations where, a group of professionals could sit down and do that far in advance and work out the risks and threats. And that's why having an operational risk register is so important, is because subject matter experts sit together and brainstorm problems. They identify the threats, they identify the particular errors that can happen, such as this. They can identify risk controls that they can put in place, and a risk control might be a satellite phone, 24-hour phone number to ring an operations advisor back in the company. It might be a procedure that says that under this circumstance, full fuel can only be carried, whatever it is. And they're the type of things that an operational risk register will do for you.
And that probably leads me to CASA's special audit in this particular case. Are there things that have been highlighted now through that special audit that's now become in the public arena that you would have said should have appeared in ATSB's report from either an organisational or regulatory perspective?
Yes, definitely.
Would you like to briefly outline those?
It's the types of things required under an ICAO Annex 13 report are the regulatory oversight of the operator, the regulator's findings, the regulator's oversight of the operator, and the operator's organisational matters. They're all detailed in my report, and they go into such things as the structure of the company, the supervision of the company, those sort of details. So, yeah, It's more or less absent in this report.
Okay.
Chair's gone. Senator Zethel.
Questions, Mr. Aherne, a number of questions to ask you, so I'll try and be concise if your answers can be concise as well. Further to Senator Fawcett's line of questioning in relation to the CASA special audit not finding its way into the ATSB report, I think the rationale was that it wasn't relevant in terms of the sequence of events that occurred on that night. Do you agree or disagree with that proposition?
I disagree with that.
Do you find it extraordinary that it wasn't included, the CASA special audit wasn't included in the ATSB final report?
I'd go beyond saying it's extraordinary. I'd say it's bizarre.
Okay. Can we just go to the issue of the status of flight of medical personnel on board? Are they passengers or crew?
They're crew.
And therefore there should be requirements in terms of doing the appropriate wet drills and the like.
Correct.
And in terms of what about the competing demands of that medical evacuation flight of both the needs of the patient and the flight demands? I mean, how do you balance those? And further, you know, do operators have adequate risk training? We'll do that in a minute. But in terms of those medical evacuation flights, you're saying that it should have been reclassified years ago, but it has yet to be so.
Yes. The aeromedical flights, because they're done on the run, you're going into areas that you've never been before. Sometimes you're going into areas that don't even have suitable lighting, or there's all sorts of places where you're going, and risks and threats and errors come at you on the run. They're completely unplanned and unexpected. In other words, they're dynamic. So if you don't have an operational risk register worked out in advance to know what your type of operation is, what your role is, you can't be expected to just have people who have never done this work largely in their life going out and doing this work, picking up patients who believe they've got the highest level of aviation safety in their interests. And we find that it's actually at the lowest level. It's the equivalent of agricultural spraying.
And that's where it's currently classified? Okay. I mean, do you think operators have adequate risk training to make assessments about their risk or benefit under the regulations?
Oh, sorry, Senator. What?
So, do you think operators have adequate risk training to make assessments about the risk or benefit, the risk or benefits under the regulations in terms of undertaking this sort of work?
The education for the industry has been out there for quite some time, certainly since 2009 with the introduction of safety management systems with the RPT, or that's the regular public transport airlines. But this philosophy of risk-based oversight is really quite good because it fills in the grey areas and the blanks that the regulations and the procedures just don't cover. And it is impossible for a regulator to cover every situation. And CASA will never win in this, but my saying is we will never get to utopia, but what's wrong with trying to get there, Right. So we've just got to keep trying, and risk-based approach is where the gaps, if you like, are filled in by a risk-based philosophy, and it comes as an outcome in the end.
Two or three more issues that I want to touch on. The Chief Pilot had a key role here under the legislation to ensure what, in terms of flight training, flight preparations. Let's not. I mean, you can just refer us to the 28 BE.
It is in the report, but the responsibilities in the operator's operations manual spells it out.
Okay.
It's in the
Can I
report.
put this to you? If the Chief Pilot at the time of the accident went on to work for CASA, how do you sort out any potential conflicts in relation to that? In your view, how should that be dealt with?
Well, I note that in CASA's special audit that the operator was received request for corrective action on 3 failings of the Civil Aviation Act in terms of the oversight of the organisation, Section 28 BE. That is a very serious breach. That's a breach of the Parliament. It's much higher than the regulations, and I find it odd that the person charged with that responsibility and oversight would then go on to work for the regulator, given the nature of the findings. But,